They say the world belongs to the loudest voices, but what if your quiet presence could speak louder than any microphone? If you're over 55, you've likely lived a life full of lessons, yet still feel invisible in rooms that value flash over depth. This story is for you, a powerful reminder that influence doesn't retire and dignity doesn't age. Stay until the end to see how 5 quiet words from Chuck Norris turned a room of doubters into believers. Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories that speak to who you are. It was one of those mornings in early spring when the light came in sideways and nothing felt quite certain. The kind of morning where a man might sit at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, not because he's cold, but because holding something steady feels like holding himself steady. In the town of Crossfield, the air smelled faintly of cut grass, diesel fuel, and something older, something people don't talk about much anymore: honor, history, memory. Chuck Norris stood in his garage, the kind that hadn't seen a car in years, but still knew the sound of tools being picked up and set down. His old truck sat in the driveway, not because it was broken, but because Chuck preferred to walk into places where people forgot to expect anything. He tied the laces on his boots, the same pair he'd worn for the last 10 years, and zipped up his jacket. Denim, worn soft at the elbow, practical, quiet, like him. He didn't tell anyone he was going to the town meeting that morning. He didn't need to. He'd seen the notice in the paper, which was in the same spot where they posted obituaries and Sunday night bingo. The city council would be voting on whether to sell the Veterans Hall. They called it a community asset. Chuck called it something else. A place where silence wasn't loneliness, where men nodded instead of talking, and where what was left unsaid mattered more than what was said aloud. He took the back streets towards City Hall, past the bakery that still made cinnamon rolls big enough to count as a meal, past the barber shop that hadn't changed the calendar on the wall since 1998. People waved. Chuck nodded. No small talk, just presence. He liked it that way. When he arrived, the parking lot was half full. Pickup trucks, a few sedans, and one bright red convertible that didn't belong to anyone from town. Inside the building, the air buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of small talk. Plastic chairs scraped across tile floors. A pot of coffee sat near the back, burnt from sitting too long, but still doing its job. Chuck didn't linger. He signed his name on the speaker list with a pen that barely worked and took a seat in the back row, not because he wanted to hide, but because he knew enough to let others speak first. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes scanned the room, not judging, just absorbing. Faces he'd seen around town. Some younger, some older, a few he knew by name, most he didn't. But he recognized the look. People who'd lived enough to know when something real was slipping through their fingers. At 9 sharp, the mayor called the meeting to order. She wore a blue suit, stiff in the shoulders, and read from a printed agenda like it was a grocery list. The first items passed quickly: new benches for the park, a vote on street maintenance. Then came the topic that had brought Chuck there. Agenda item 4, proposed sale of the Crossfield Veterans Hall. A developer had made an offer. Good money, they said, promised to build a modern resort and golf center, attract visitors, raise property values, bring jobs. The usual promises that float like helium until no one remembers what they used to weigh down. The council members nodded politely, almost in rhythm, like they'd already made up their minds. The first speaker was a young woman from the city planning office. She talked numbers, zoning, economic impact. She clicked through a slideshow full of renderings, all glass walls and fountains. No brick, no history, no soul. Next came an older man, a retired Marine, voice shaking from Parkinson's or nerves, maybe both. He spoke about his grandfather's photo still hanging in the hallway, said he didn't expect them to understand, just wanted them to remember. The room was quiet but distant. People listened, but with the kind of patience reserved for things that don't really change outcomes. A few more residents spoke. Some are in favor, most against. Then the moderator read the next name on the list. Charles Norris. A ripple went through the room. Not loud, just enough for eyebrows to rise and backs to straighten slightly. One of the younger councilmen, Bryce Landon, leaned toward his colleague and muttered something. Chuck caught the words. If he starts talking about Vietnam or some old karate movie, I'm out of here. Chuck stood slowly, no limp, no swagger, just a man who knew the weight of his own body and didn't rush it. He stepped into the aisle, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders square. The room didn't know whether to expect a speech or a story. What they got was neither. He reached the podium and paused. No notes, no phone, just breathe. I won't take long, he said. The words hung in the air, not heavy, just certain. He glanced at the room, eyes calm. I came here to talk about a building, not because it's old, not because it's mine, but it gave something back to people who had nothing left to give. Silence, not the kind that begs to be filled, but the kind that makes you pay attention. When I came back from overseas, I didn't go home. I went to that hall. I didn't know how to be anything but a soldier. That place taught me how to be a man again, how to sit still, how to listen, how to matter in a world that had already moved on. The mayor looked down. Bryce leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to find something to scoff at, but coming up empty. Chuck kept going. I've trained soldiers, I've buried them. I've watched parents cry with nothing to hold but a folded flag. That hall was where we grieved. Where we healed, we reminded each other that we were still human. If you turn it into a spa, just make sure you remember the names under the carpet. He stopped, not because he ran out of things to say, because he had said enough. Then he stepped back. No flourish, no look for approval, just a nod and a quiet return to his seat. The room stayed still for a moment, like the kind of quiet after a storm when the sky hasn't decided what to do next. And in that pause something shifted. No vote has been taken yet, no decision made, but the air felt different. Chuck sat again in the same place in the back, same straight posture, same steady eyes, but now, he wasn't just another man in the room. He was the reason the room had stopped pretending not to care. The meeting rolled on, at least on paper. The next name on the list was called, but the man didn't stand. He shook his head and whispered that he no longer needed to speak. Someone else had said what he couldn't. The moderator glanced around, unsure whether to move on or wait for silence to release its grip. She chose to move on, but the room hadn't really resumed. Bryce Landon cleared his throat, leaned toward the microphone, and made a comment that was half a joke and half a jab. He said something about sentiment being powerful, but policy needing numbers. A few people nodded. Most didn't react. Chuck didn't move. The mayor thanked all the speakers and reminded everyone that a formal vote would take place in 2 weeks. That was standard procedure. They always left time to cool down public emotions before casting a decision. But this time, nobody seemed eager to leave. People lingered. Conversations didn't start right away. There was a pause, like they didn't want to disturb something sacred that had briefly settled in the room. Chuck stood slowly, again with no rush, and walked toward the back of the room. A few folks nodded to him. A woman in her 60s touched his arm gently as he passed. "Thank you," she said, almost under her breath. He nodded back. Nothing more. He didn't need more. Outside, the sun had risen higher. It was a little warmer now, but Chuck didn't take off his jacket. He walked past the parking lot, down toward the edge of the greenway that bordered City Hall. The breeze stirred the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed, stubborn against the early season weeds. Chuck paused under the shade of an old pecan tree. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo, edges bent, colors fading. It showed a group of 6 men standing in front of the Veterans Hall. Young faces, strong postures, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Chuck was second from the left, back when he had more muscle than lines and eyes that hadn't seen quite so much. He stared at the picture for a while, then he folded it gently and put it away. He didn't need to relive the past, he just didn't want it erased. Back inside, the council members gathered their papers, but they weren't talking strategy. Bryce looked agitated. The mayor sat a little straighter than before. One of the older members, a man named Harris, leaned back and whispered that maybe they ought to think twice before signing off on anything just yet. It wasn't about votes anymore, not really. Something had happened that didn't fit into minutes or motions. Chuck hadn't argued, he hadn't begged, he hadn't threatened, but he'd reminded the room that some spaces matter not because they're efficient, but because they're sacred. He hadn't spoken for applause. He'd spoken because something important was about to disappear, and he couldn't sit by and watch it happen in silence. Later that afternoon, the town paper published a short paragraph on the meeting, buried in the civic announcements section just above the Bridge Club results. It said that longtime resident Charles Norris had addressed the council regarding the proposed sale of the Veterans Hall. It didn't say what he said. It didn't say how the room changed. But the people who were there, they remembered. In the days that followed, the conversation spread. Not loud, not viral, just steady. In coffee shops, post office lines, and church gatherings, someone would mention the meeting and someone else would say, "I was there," or "I heard about it. Did you hear what he said?" And slowly the idea that had once seemed like a done deal began to fray around the edges. Chuck, meanwhile, went back to his routine. Morning walks, afternoon reading, fixing up small things around his house that didn't really need fixing, but kept his hands moving. He didn't bring up the meeting to anyone, didn't expect anything from it. He just believed that presence mattered, and sometimes that was enough. That weekend, someone placed a bouquet of small flags on the steps of the Veterans Hall. No note, no ribbon, just the flags, sticking upright in the cracks between the concrete. On Monday, there were 20 more. Chuck drove by once, didn't stop, just slowed a little and looked out the window. He smiled, not the kind of smile that asks to be seen, the kind that simply says something good is still alive. On Tuesday, Chuck received a letter. Not an email, not a text, a real letter, stamped, folded twice, addressed in cursive that looked like it hadn't been written in years. It came from a man named Joel McCarthy, someone Chuck hadn't seen in nearly 4 decades. Joel had moved out west in the late 80s, disappeared into a different life. The letter said he'd seen a clip from the meeting, not a video but a photo in the local Crossfield paper, scanned and shared by someone who knew someone. Joel said he remembered that hall, remembered the nights they sat inside it after drills, boots off, shoulders heavy, trading stories they didn't tell anyone else. He thanked Chuck not for the speech, for not letting it fade away. Chuck read the letter twice. Then he placed it in the top drawer of his desk, next to his service medal and a key that no longer opened anything. That evening, he walked by the Veterans Hall again, not because he needed to check on it, but because he felt drawn to it the way people are drawn to old houses, knowing they hold more than rooms. The sun was setting, golden light caught the dust on the window glass, and for a moment the building looked almost alive, like it was breathing again. There was a teenager sitting on the steps, tall, lanky, restless legs bouncing. Chuck recognized him, kid from the grocery store, part-time bagger, quiet, always polite. The boy looked up, asked if what people were saying was true, that Chuck had once trained soldiers. He used to fight real fights, not just on camera. Chuck nodded, said something simple. "I've been around." That was all. The boy asked why he cared so much about the building, said most people his age didn't even know what went on inside. Chuck looked at the doors, then said, "It's not about what it is now, it's about what it gave. Some places aren't built for tourists, they're built for people who survived." The boy didn't quite understand, but he nodded anyway. Respect, even if not full comprehension. That was enough. The following week, before the vote, the town received an unexpected delivery. A folded American flag was mailed anonymously and a note was attached. The handwriting was shaky, written on yellow legal paper. It read, "This flag once flew over our camp in Kandahar. I took it home in my pack, next to a photo of my squad and a letter I never sent. That hall was the first place I ever felt safe again. If you sell it, at least know what you're trading. My memories are not for sale." The mayor read it aloud during the pre-vote session. There were no comments after, just a pause. Then someone from the back of the room stood up. A woman in her 70s. She wasn't on the agenda. She wasn't holding a paper. She just said that Chuck reminded us that we still have something worth protecting. We shouldn't need a second reminder. When it came time to vote, Bryce Landon sat motionless. He didn't speak, didn't argue. When the tally was called, he raised his hand with the others. Unanimous. The Veterans Hall would stay. There were no cheers, no banners, just quiet nods and the sound of chairs being pushed back slowly, respectfully. Chuck wasn't there for the vote. He was in his garage, tuning an old guitar that hadn't been played since his brother passed. Not because he planned to play it in public, just because the strings were still worth tightening. Later that night, someone dropped off a fresh pot of coffee and a thank you note at his door. No name, just the words. "You didn't speak loudly, but we heard you." Chuck read the note, poured a cup, sat by the window as the porch light buzzed in the distance. He didn't need the credit, didn't want it. He just didn't want the silence to outlast the stories. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like that might just be possible. Chuck didn't expect anyone to follow up. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't expect resistance either. He thought the vote settled things. Most men of his age with his miles know better than to count on endings. What feels like closure to some often wakes up as another kind of beginning. A few days after the vote, Chuck was in the hardware store. He liked the place, still had wooden floors that creaked. The aisles smelled like oil, rope, and time. The owner, Vince, had taken it over from his father and still rang up sales on a metal register that chimed with every button. Vince greeted Chuck with a nod, the same one they'd traded for 30 years. As Chuck picked up a new garden hose and a pack of light bulbs, someone walked in behind him and didn't speak right away. There wasn't hesitation. It was a calculation, the kind of pause that says the words are rehearsed but not ready. Chuck turned slightly and saw Bryce Landon, the same councilman who'd mocked him, the same young man who had voted yes in the end, but without pride. He looked smaller here, without the suit, jeans, faded polo, no podium, just a man now. Bryce cleared his throat and said he'd been meaning to stop by. Chuck raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. Bryce continued, saying he wanted to apologize not just for what he said at the meeting, but for what he didn't understand at the time. He looked Chuck in the eye, and for once his voice didn't try to control the room. Chuck nodded slowly. He said nothing for a moment, then replied with something Bryce didn't expect. He told him it wasn't about offense, it was about listening. You can say something stupid, we all do. What matters is whether you listen afterward. That's the part that decides what kind of man you are. Bryce looked like he'd been handed something he didn't know how to hold. He nodded, said thank you, and then he left without buying anything. Chuck paid for his hose and bulbs, tipped his hat to Vince, and stepped outside into the brightness of noon. He wasn't angry. He wasn't satisfied either. He just was, like always. Later that week, a knock came at his door. It was a teenager from town, maybe 17, with an armful of folders. Said his name was Jonah. Said he was doing a school project about the history of Crossfield, and his teacher told him Chuck might be able to help. Chuck tilted his head and asked what the boy wanted to know. Jonah said he wasn't sure yet, said he wanted to understand why the Veterans Hall was such a big deal. He said he knew the vote kept it from being sold, but he didn't get why people got so emotional about it. It was just a building. Chuck didn't correct him, not right away. He invited Jonah to sit on the porch. He poured him a glass of lemonade and watched as the boy tried to balance his folders and notebook as if it were a final exam. Chuck waited until Jonah settled, then began, not with facts, but with a question. Have you ever been somewhere that made you feel different just by being inside it? Jonah shrugged. Maybe church, maybe his grandmother's house. Chuck nodded, said that was a start. Then he told him what the building had meant, not just for him, but for the people who had walked through its doors and needed something they couldn't name. A place where no one had to explain their scars, where no one asked what you did to earn silence, where every picture on the wall held a story no one had written down, but everyone remembered anyway. Jonah listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take many notes either, but his eyes stayed locked on Chuck's face, like he knew this was more important than anything he could Google. After an hour, Chuck stood up, walked inside, and came back with a small box. Inside were photos, patches, a ribbon, and a folded program from a funeral that happened years ago. He handed the box to Jonah. Said he could borrow it, but he had better bring it back. Jonah looked stunned. He asked why Chuck trusted him. Chuck said, because if I don't, none of this survives. That evening, Chuck sat on his porch alone. The air smelled like soil and honeysuckle. A car drove by slowly, windows down, music low. Chuck didn't wave. He just listened. The vote had saved the building, but something else had been set in motion. Young people were asking questions. Old neighbors were talking again. The hall that had stood quiet for years now had footsteps on its steps, voices in its walls. Chuck didn't need credit, but he was glad the silence had cracked open. The following Sunday, Chuck attended service at the small chapel 2 blocks from his house. He didn't go every week. He believed in reverence, not routine, but something told him to show up that day. Maybe it was the boy, Jonah. Maybe it was the feeling that stories only last if they're passed on with care. He sat near the back, the way older men do when they're more comfortable watching than being watched. The hymns were familiar, a little slower than they used to be. The pews creaked when people shifted. Some heads nodded in rhythm, others are asleep. Chuck listened more than he sang. His voice wasn't what it used to be, but his memory held every word. After the service, as folks gathered near the steps for small talk and coffee, a woman approached him. She looked to be in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She introduced herself as Linda Garcia. City Council, she said. Chuck knew the name, though he hadn't spoken to her before. Linda said she'd been thinking about what he said. Not just the speech, the silence after. She said it reminded her of her father, a Vietnam veteran who never talked about the war, but always wore his boots to mow the lawn, even 30 years later. Chuck smiled and said that some things never really come off. Linda nodded. Then she told him something unexpected. She said she'd been going through some old records, not town records, personal ones. Her father had kept a notebook. In it, he'd written down the names of people who'd helped him after he came home. Most were just first names, but one stood out. Chuck Norris. It wasn't much, just a line. Norris taught me how to breathe again. taught me how to be home without leaving my unit behind." Chuck went quiet. He hadn't known Linda's father by name. He'd helped a lot of men back then. Some stuck, some vanished, but hearing that felt like finding a piece of yourself you forgot had gone missing. Linda said she wanted to do more, not just vote the right way. She wanted to reopen the Veterans Hall for community use. Workshops, support groups, history nights. She said people needed more than a place to remember. They needed a place to gather. Chuck agreed, but with a quiet caution. He told her not to build it around names or monuments. Build it around hands. What people could do together. Build it like a porch, not a museum. Linda wrote that down. Over the next 2 weeks, a few flyers started showing up around town. Handwritten, photocopied, taped to doors and bus stops. Community night at Crossfield Veterans Hall. Bring a story, bring a friend. Coffee provided. Chuck saw one posted on the wall at the post office. He smiled, then shook his head like he couldn't believe it was really happening. But he showed up that Thursday night. Didn't say he would, didn't RSVP. He just came. There were 27 people there, more than anyone expected. Some old, some young, some in jeans, some in Sunday clothes. Someone brought a guitar, someone else brought brownies, and for the first time in years, the old building sounded alive again. People shared stories. Not speeches, stories. About the first time they drove through town, about a brother who never made it home, about a recipe passed down from a grandmother who cooked during the Depression. Chuck didn't speak right away. He sat in the corner, hands clasped, listening the way he always had. But near the end of the evening, someone asked if he would share something. He didn't talk about war, or medals, or anything heroic. He told them about a night in 1981 when the roof of the hall started leaking during a winter storm. He and 2 others spent 6 hours in the attic with flashlights and buckets, soaking wet, patching holes with duct tape and prayer. They didn't do it for credit. They did it because they didn't want the next guy walking through that door to get rained on. The room laughed. Then it quieted. That story said more than any speech. After the gathering, people lingered outside. The air had turned cooler, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. Someone had lit a lantern. Chuck stood near the edge of the group, watching, not leading. That's what made him different. His influence didn't rise from a stage. It came from standing still when others drifted. Before he left, Linda came over. Said she'd invited someone to next week's gathering, a journalist. Not from the big outlets, just local news, but someone who cared about real stories. Chuck didn't say much, just asked if the journalist had ever served. Linda said no, but her brother had. Chuck nodded, then said something she didn't expect. Just make sure he listens before he writes. Some people use stories to fill columns. Others use them to fill gaps in understanding. Linda promised she'd make sure. That night, Chuck sat on his porch again. The breeze was light. The sky was clean, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like the town had remembered how to sit still, together. Not everything needed to be fixed. Some things just needed to be held. By the time the next community night came round, the crowd had doubled. Folding chairs had to be pulled from the storage closet. Someone brought an old percolator to help with the coffee. Another brought a homemade sign that simply read, "Welcome back." Chuck arrived just after sunset. Not early, not late. He walked in wearing the same denim jacket, the same steady presence. The room buzzed, not loudly, but with the kind of hum that happens when people start believing something good is possible again. This time the age range had widened. 2 high school seniors sat next to a retired postmaster. A mother of 3 who worked nights stood in the back with her youngest asleep on her shoulder. The journalist Linda mentioned was there too, young, wide-eyed, holding a notepad like it might catch fire if he dropped it. Chuck took a seat near the back again. He didn't look at the reporter. He didn't need to. The night opened with a story from a local farmer about the flood of '93, how the Veterans Hall served as a shelter for 14 families, 2 dogs, and a goat named Harriet. The story brought laughter, then silence, then a ripple of remembering. Everyone had their own version of that flood. Everyone had their own Harriet. Then Linda stood and introduced the journalist, whose name was Matthew Cole. He thanked everyone for letting him be there. He said he came to write a piece on community resilience, but what he was hearing felt bigger. He said he wouldn't ask questions. He'd just listen. Chuck watched him carefully, not judging, measuring. Later in the evening, someone asked Chuck if he'd be willing to say a few words. This time he stood without hesitation. He looked around the room and said he didn't have a speech. He didn't believe in speeches. He believed in shared weight. He said the building didn't matter because of what it looked like. It mattered because of what it held. Not just events or plaques, but moments when people showed up tired or grieving or scared and left feeling a little less alone. He told them that not every scar shows up on the skin, and that places like this were among the last where those invisible wounds could breathe without explanation. People didn't applaud. They didn't need to. They understood. After the event, Matthew Cole approached Chuck outside. He said he hoped to include Chuck's story, maybe even center the article around him. Chuck said that was fine, but only if he didn't call him a hero. Matthew asked why not. Chuck said heroes want to be seen. I just wanted to make sure no one forgot we were here. Matthew didn't write that part down. He just nodded. Some words don't need ink. They need memory. The article came out a week later. It didn't mention Chuck's name until the 5th paragraph, but when it did, it told the truth. About what he said, about how the town responded, about how something small had become something sacred again. People read it, shared it, talked about it over breakfast and in barber shops, but Chuck didn't care about the article. He cared that more people came to the next meeting. Someone started bringing a tray of cookies. That someone else began organizing a ride service for older residents who didn't drive at night. The building had been saved by a vote, but it had been revived by a choice. People were showing up. Chuck noticed little things, like the way folks began walking slower when they passed the hall, like how the flag out front was suddenly being raised again every morning, like how the lights inside stayed on a little later, not because someone forgot to turn them off, but because someone didn't want to leave just yet. One morning, Chuck stopped by early, just to check in. The door was open. Inside, Jonah, the student, was sweeping the floor. Not because he was told to, because he thought it should be done. Chuck watched from the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. He didn't say much, just nodded. Jonah smiled, said he was putting together a photo board of the town's veterans for a school project. He wanted to hang it in the front hallway. Chuck said that was a good idea. Then he pulled a key from his pocket, the old brass kind, heavy, scratched. He handed it to Jonah. Said, "In case you ever get here before I do." Jonah looked at the key like it was a medal. Said he didn't know what to say. Chuck told him, "Just keep showing up." That afternoon, Chuck walked back home, slower than usual, not because of age or pain, because the air felt different. Because some days it's worth noticing how the light falls across the pavement, or how a breeze tugs at your collar like an old friend. He stopped by the hardware store again, not for anything he needed. I just wanted to see Vince and ask if the roof patch from last month held up. Vince said it had. Then poured 2 cups of burnt coffee and said nothing for a while, which Chuck appreciated. Men like them didn't need constant noise to feel understood. Before he left, Chuck asked if Vince remembered the old woodwork that used to line the Veterans Hall. Vince nodded. said he helped stain the original beams with his dad when he was 13. Chuck told him the boy, Jonah, was starting a photo wall. Vince nodded again. Said he'd find a few pictures from his attic, the kind that weren't digital, the kind that smelled like ink and time. Later that week, something unexpected happened. A council aide stopped by Chuck's porch holding a formal envelope. Inside was a note inviting him to the next town meeting. Not as a speaker, not as a resident, as a guest of honor. Chuck didn't know what to make of it. He didn't like being singled out, but he also understood that sometimes accepting a moment isn't about ego. It's about allowing others to say thank you in their own way. He attended the meeting and sat where they asked, up front this time. The room was full, not just of people, but of attention. Eyes that saw him not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as something better. A neighbor, a keeper of memory. A man who still showed up when it was easier not to. The mayor stood and spoke briefly. She acknowledged the changes, the renewed community use of the Veterans Hall, the increase in local volunteers, the flood of interest from younger generations. She paused, then looked at Chuck and said, "None of this happened because we passed a motion. It happened because someone reminded us why it mattered." There was no applause, just a standing stillness. Chuck didn't rise, didn't wave. He just nodded. After the meeting, he waited until the room cleared, then walked out slowly. A few people stopped him to shake his hand. He accepted every gesture with quiet grace. A man doesn't need to raise his voice when his presence has already done the talking. That night, he sat on his porch with the lights off, listening to the crickets and the hush of distant traffic. The town felt alive again. Not louder, just fuller, like a song that had found its rhythm. He thought about the boy sweeping the hall, the old friends who'd passed through its doors, the young woman who brought brownies without needing a reason. He thought about the fact that something sacred had been saved, not by anger, not by force, but by stillness, by presence, by the truth spoken at the right moment. He sipped his coffee, closed his eyes, and let the silence stretch. Because sometimes, when you've lived long enough, you stop trying to be heard. You just make sure what you say is worth remembering. The Veterans Hall had been quiet for years, not empty, just resting, like an old friend with stories folded into its corners, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Now the chairs were full again. Every Thursday night the circle grew. Faces new and familiar. Some came just to listen. Others brought folded pages or photos in worn envelopes. A rhythm had formed. Not organized, not polished, but real. One Thursday evening, Chuck arrived to find the parking lot half full a half hour early. A group of teens stood near the steps, not smoking, not shouting, just waiting. Some with notebooks, one with a guitar slung across his back. Chuck walked past them with a nod and they nodded back, not because of fame, but because of something simpler. Recognition. Inside, the room felt electric, not loud, but charged. Linda stood near the front, looking over a stack of printed papers. The journalist, Matthew Cole, sat quietly in a corner with a small recorder and an open notebook. He'd been back 3 weeks in a row. Still listening. Tonight was different. You could feel it in the air. There was a kind of stillness that didn't come from lack of movement, but from anticipation. Like everyone sensed something needed to be said, but no one quite knew how to say it yet. The first few people stood and shared short reflections. A mechanic talked about losing his brother in a war no one remembers anymore. A middle school teacher told a story about teaching the Pledge of Allegiance to kids who didn't know what half the words meant. A young woman in nursing scrubs recounted visiting the hall as a child and thinking it smelled like her grandfather's coat. Then Bryce Landon showed up. Not late, not early, just unexpected. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a navy blue sweatshirt and jeans. His face was calm, but you could tell he'd thought this through. He stood near the back for a while, then finally stepped forward. Linda gave him a look. No permission, just space. Bryce took the floor and thanked the group for letting him speak. His voice was steady but not rehearsed. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what it means to inherit a place, not by blood, but by responsibility. He said he hadn't earned this town's trust, but he wanted to rebuild it. Some people nodded, some stared, a few crossed their arms. Then he said he wanted to invite someone forward. Chuck looked up slowly. He hadn't expected his name, he hadn't planned to speak, but he stood, not because he was ready, because some moments don't wait for readiness, they wait for courage. He stepped into the center of the room, took a breath, looked at the crowd, young faces, old hands, stories behind every pair of eyes. And then he said 5 sentences. I trained soldiers before they ever saw a battlefield. I've written letters to 37 families who never saw their sons come back. I don't have war medals. I have names tattooed in my memory. I'm not fighting anyone. I'm just reminding you what this building was built for. That was it. 5 sentences. Each one landed like a stone in water, rippling through every person in the room, one layer at a time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean into drama. He just stood there, the way a tree stands in a storm. Not because it has something to prove, but because it knows it belongs there. The room didn't clap, not out of disrespect, because clapping would have broken the moment, and some moments aren't meant to be applauded, they're meant to be held. Chuck sat down. Matthew Cole, the journalist, didn't move for a long while. Then he slowly turned off his recorder and closed his notebook. He didn't need to write anything else that night. It was already written in the room. Linda wiped her eyes and said nothing. The teen with the guitar pulled it close to his chest and strummed something soft under his breath, like the room needed a place to rest. Later that night, Chuck walked outside into the cool air and found Bryce waiting for him on the steps. He didn't say much, just thanked him. Not for the words, for showing up, for staying, for standing still when it would have been easier to walk away. Chuck nodded. Then he looked up at the stars. They were clear that night. They knew how rare it was for a man to speak the truth and be heard without having to fight for the floor. He turned to Bryce and said something simple. The room didn't need another leader. It needed someone to remember. Over the next few days, something shifted. Not publicly, quietly. Like a door being opened in a house that had been locked for too long. At the diner near Main and 3rd, someone wrote those 5 sentences on a napkin and taped them to the tip jar. At the grocery store, the teenager who'd once asked Chuck about the building told his manager he wanted to volunteer at the next town cleanup. And at the Veterans Hall, someone had left a bundle of wildflowers, with no note, just tucked into the door handle. Like a small thank you, she whispered. Chuck noticed, but he didn't react. He kept walking his morning route. Same streets, same pace. He greeted people with nods, and sometimes they nodded back with something new in their eyes. Not awe, not fanfare, just the kind of respect that doesn't need to be explained. He didn't need people to remember his name. He needed them to remember the weight of presence. That was enough. At the following week's community night, the room was full before dark. Someone brought folding chairs from the church down the street. A local baker donated a tray of pies. The woman who made them said she didn't want a speech. She just wanted to feed people who remembered where they came from. Chuck arrived and took his usual seat in the back. This time, people didn't pretend not to notice him. They didn't fawn either. They made space. They gave him the dignity of quiet, the kind that said, "We see you, and we know why you matter." Linda opened the evening with a simple note. She said tonight's gathering wasn't about looking back, it was about passing forward. She invited anyone of any age to come share what the Veterans Hall meant to them or what they hoped it could mean for the future. One by one they stood. A high school senior talked about how his grandfather never talked about the war but always straightened up when they drove past that building. A retired nurse said the hall was where she learned to give her first injection during Red Cross training in 1975. A man in his 30s, eyes still worn from something he couldn't name, said he came because it was the only place in town that didn't expect him to be okay. Chuck listened. Every story carved a new layer in the room. He didn't take notes. He didn't lean forward. He just stayed, anchored. Then, something unexpected happened. A boy, no older than 10, stood up and asked if he could say something. The room hushed instantly. He walked slowly to the front and held a crumpled piece of paper. He said his name was Daniel. His dad used to sit in the last row every Thursday night. He said that he hadn't seen his dad in a while, but he thought that if he had come to the same room and sat in the same chair, maybe he could feel close to him again. Nobody moved. The boy looked over at Chuck. He said, "That man was the first person to say good evening to me when I came here. I didn't know who he was, but I remembered his voice. It made me feel like I belonged." Chuck didn't flinch. But his hands, folded in his lap, curled slightly tighter. The boy sat down. No one clapped, but someone near the back wiped their eyes, and someone else reached for a hand they hadn't held in a long time. That night, Chuck didn't leave right away. He stayed until the room emptied. Then he walked to the chair the boy had sat in. He placed his hand on the back of it, just for a moment, then turned and walked out into the cool air. Linda caught up with him in the parking lot. She said the council had received dozens of letters since the article. People wanted to donate, to volunteer, to start programs. Veterans from other towns had written, asking if they could come visit. Chuck smiled, but said little. She asked if he ever imagined it would grow like this. Chuck said no. Then he paused and added, "I wasn't trying to grow something. I was just trying to stop the forgetting." 2 days later, Chuck received a letter. Not an email, not typed. A real letter, written in blue ink with slanted handwriting that looked rushed but careful. It came from a man named Carl Benson. The name didn't register at first, but as Chuck read the first few lines, it clicked. Carl had served under him once, briefly, during a training operation that had gone sideways in the desert back in '84. Chuck hadn't seen or heard from him in nearly 4 decades. Carl wrote that he'd seen Chuck's name mentioned in the local paper. He wasn't sure if it was the same Chuck Norris, but when he read the 5 sentences quoted in the article, he knew. No one else would have said it like that. He wrote that after that mission, he left the service, drifted for a while, and tried to forget. But something about what Chuck said in that room, what had been shared by so many others, had made him remember the part of himself he thought was lost. He said, "Thank you," and then at the very bottom of the letter, he wrote a sentence that stayed with Chuck all day. "I didn't die in that desert, but part of me almost did. You carried me further than I thought I'd go. I just didn't know it until now." Chuck folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer with the others. The ones he never talked about. The ones that reminded him he wasn't just a name people recognized, but a bridge between moments people couldn't forget. That evening he walked to the hall alone. There wasn't a meeting. The lights were off, but he had a key, and sometimes a room needs a little company even when it's quiet. He walked the perimeter slowly, ran his hand along the old wood paneling. He looked up at the ceiling, and he once helped patch in the dead of winter. In the back corner, a box of old flags had been stacked neatly. Some were folded, triangle-shaped, others are worn and loose, with edges frayed from time and use. He took one out, sat on the bench by the window, and held it. Not for ceremony, for memory. Outside, the streetlights buzzed faintly. A dog barked 3 houses down. The world moved, unaware. But inside that room, history breathed again. And Chuck, with his hands rough from years of building and breaking, sat still and let it. Not because he needed the world to listen, but because sometimes presence is the only language that truth speaks clearly. It started with a question, not a loud one, not public, just a quiet message sent to the city clerk's office by a retired journalist named Harold Green, who had moved back to Crossfield after 30 years in Austin. He wasn't trying to make trouble, he was just trying to understand. Harold had read Matthew Cole's article. He'd even attended one of the Veterans Hall gatherings, sitting in the back with a notepad he didn't use. What struck him wasn't the stories or even the building. It was the sudden shift in tone from the town council, a kind of pivot that felt less like reflection and more like someone trying to get ahead of something.
So Harold did what old reporters do. He started pulling threads. He requested old council transcripts, meeting minutes, land evaluation reports. He visited the assessor's office and quietly asked for copies of the original offer letter from the development group that wanted to purchase the Veterans Hall. What he found didn't surprise him, but it stirred something. The offer to buy the hall had been made 3 months before it became public. It had been reviewed in a closed-door meeting under a vague item labeled Public Asset Valuation. The minutes showed that Councilman Bryce Landon had been the one to introduce the contract. But that wasn't the part that concerned Harold. The part that caught his eye was a set of emails between Bryce and a man named Franklin Reeve, CEO of Reeve Development Group, private, well-connected, and, as it turned out, brother to a certain council chair. Harold had no axe to grind. He wasn't out to ruin reputations, but he understood one thing better than most. When people try to erase history, they don't do it with bulldozers. They do it with paperwork. He made copies, wrote a short summary. I walked it over to the town library where Matthew Cole was scheduled to host a public Q&A on journalism ethics with local youth. Harold waited until the event ended, then handed the folder to Matthew with nothing more than a nod. Matthew read it that night, twice, then a third time, slower. The next morning, he made a decision not to publish. Not yet. He made calls, quiet ones, to confirm, to verify, to double-check, because some stories, once told, can't be taken back. That same day, Chuck was at the Veterans Hall repairing a loose hinge on the back door. He didn't know what was coming, he just knew the building deserved to feel cared for. He stood on a small ladder, hands steady, eyes focused. The wind outside was light but steady, like it had been watching this town for a long time and was finally starting to exhale. Linda arrived around noon. She looked unsettled. Chuck asked if something was wrong. She didn't answer right away. She said she'd received an anonymous message from someone claiming a council member had intentionally withheld parts of the development deal. She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore it. Chuck didn't look surprised. He just said, "Some people trade memory for ambition, but memory always comes back." That night, Matthew Cole requested to speak at the next council session, not as a journalist, as a resident, as someone who'd been listening. When the meeting began, the room was packed. Word had spread, not with panic, with tension, a quiet hum of people who had learned to read between the lines. Matthew stood, holding a manila folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply read the dates, the emails, the names. He finished by saying the town deserved to know who had tried to sell off its past without asking the people who lived there. And then he sat down. The room went still. Council members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Linda stared straight ahead. Bryce stood up. His voice was calm but thin. He said he'd been approached about the deal and thought it would help the town financially. He said he didn't disclose everything because he thought it wasn't relevant. He said he regretted that now. Chuck didn't move. He sat in the same seat he always did, last row, hands clasped, eyes steady. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. The mayor called for order. She said the matter would be reviewed. She promised transparency. She said all the right things. But the room had already made its decision. Later that week, Bryce stepped down. No one cheered. Chuck walked home that night slowly, not because he was tired, because some victories don't feel like wins. They feel like the weight of something has finally been set down. He didn't say much to anyone. He just fixed the door the next day, watered the grass near the entrance, and sat on the bench out front. Not because he needed to be seen, because a place can't heal if no one's there to hold it steady. The following Saturday, the town paper ran a headline across the top of its front page. Not in bold, not in red, just clean black letters on white. Councilman Resins amid ethics questions. Veterans Hall sale called off permanently. The article didn't name names beyond what was necessary. It focused more on what the town had done right than what one man had done wrong. It said the decision was no longer about real estate. It was about recognition of the quiet force that had reminded everyone what integrity looks like when it sits at the back of the room and simply waits. Chuck didn't read the article right away. A neighbor brought it by, folded neatly beside a pie. He nodded, thanked her, and set it down on the kitchen counter without comment. He spent the next hour oiling the hinges on his back gate. He finally read it later that night, after the sun went down and the windows fogged a little from the cool outside. He sat at the same table he'd had for 20 years, the same one where his wife once read the morning paper with black coffee and her elbows resting on the crossword. As he read, he felt something strange, not satisfied, not victory, just stillness. The kind that comes when a storm you didn't ask for passes through and leaves something intact. That next Thursday, the Veterans Hall filled up again. No announcement, no agenda, just people. Someone brought a projector. Someone else brought slides from 1968 showing the original dedication of the building. Black and white images flickered across the far wall. Men in uniforms, women holding hands, kids with ice cream and paper flags. Then someone stood up and read the names of every person who had ever volunteered at the hall. It took nearly 20 minutes. No one interrupted. Chuck listened to each name. Many he remembered, some he didn't, but every name had mattered. When it was done, the room stayed quiet. People didn't rush to speak. Then Jonah, the teenager, stood up. He held something in his hand, a photo. It was the first community night he had attended, the one where Chuck had handed him the key. He held it up and said he never wanted to lose what this place had given him. He said he was applying to college soon and thinking about studying history, not just to learn it, to protect it. People clapped softly, not for the boy, for the decision to try. Later that night, as the room emptied and the chairs were folded again, Linda walked over to Chuck. She said she had something to ask him. She said the council was forming a historical advisory board to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. She asked if he'd serve as a founding member. Chuck didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the windows that had seen more than they let in, at the floor that had carried the weight of grief, celebration, and return, at the corner where sunlight still hits just right in the mornings. Then he said something simple. Sit at the table, but I'll keep my seat in the back just to remember why we built it in the first place. Linda nodded. She understood. Chuck stayed after everyone left, not to clean, not to organize, just to sit. The lights buzzed gently. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. And in that stillness, something breathed. Not history, presence. The kind that doesn't end with applause or headlines, the kind that stays long after the room is empty. He sat there for a while longer, listening to the quiet he had once feared would be permanent. And for the first time in a long time, he realized it wasn't silence anymore. It was peace. 2 months after the dust settled, the real work began. Not the kind that gets printed in papers or talked about on the radio, the quiet kind. Hands on wood. Paint scraped off in long, curling ribbons. Light bulbs replaced. Windows were cleaned until the sun came through just right. Chuck never called it a restoration. That sounded too fancy, too polished. He called it care. The community didn't wait to be asked. They came in pairs, in small groups, on lunch breaks and weekends. Someone always brought coffee. Someone else always brought an extra hammer or rag. The hall had become more than preserved. It was being reawakened. One morning, Jonah showed up early. He found Chuck already there, sweeping the front steps. He offered to help, but Chuck waved him off gently and handed him a box of old brass plaques instead. "These were names," Chuck said, "not decoration. Put them where people have to see them, every time they walk in." Jonah nodded and got to work. That weekend, the walls inside the hall began to change. Old photos were framed and hung at eye level. Someone donated a map showing where local veterans had served across the world. Red pins for those who came home, blue pins for those who didn't. A yellow one sat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no label, just a small note written below it, for the ones who were never found. Chuck stood in front of that map longer than any other display. He didn't say a word, but he rested his hand on the wall before he walked away.
Linda stopped by that afternoon with a stack of papers under her arm. She said the city council had officially declared the hall a protected landmark. It couldn't be sold, couldn't be repurposed without a public vote. It was safe now. Chuck nodded, said good. She also told him the new sign had been approved, a clean wooden piece carved by a local artisan. It would read, "Chuck Norris Veterans Hall, where presence protects memory." Chuck tried to object, said it wasn't about him, but Linda shook her head and said, "It's not your name. It's what your name stood for when the rest of us forgot." He didn't argue. A few days later, they held a dedication ceremony. Not a big one, no stage, no national anthem, just folding chairs set up in rows, a podium borrowed from the library, and a crowd that filled the street and spilled into the grass. It started with silence, not scripted, just a natural hush as people stood and waited, not for a performance, for a presence. Linda spoke briefly, so did the mayor. Jonah read a list of every person who had volunteered since the building reopened. Then Matthew Cole, the journalist, stepped forward. He didn't bring a microphone, just a printed sheet of paper and his voice. He read a paragraph from his article, the one that had sparked the movement. Then he looked out over the crowd and said that if someone ever asked him what journalism meant, he'd point to this place. He'd say it means finding what's real and holding still long enough for others to see it too. Finally, they asked Chuck to come forward. He didn't prepare anything, didn't wear anything different, just his jacket, his boots, and the steadiness people had come to recognize as more valuable than any speech. He stood at the podium, looked out at the faces, at the town that had once forgotten what it meant to hold on to something that wasn't profitable but was priceless. He said he didn't have much to say, just that he was proud. Not in the building. Of the people, the ones who came back, who stayed, who showed up when it was hard. Then he said one last thing. You don't have to be loud to matter, you just have to last. The applause was quiet, but it didn't stop. It rolled gently like a tide until it became something bigger than clapping. It became an agreement, gratitude, a kind of collective thank you that didn't need words. After the crowd cleared, Chuck walked the empty hall again. Light filtered in through the clean windows. The smell of wood polish and coffee still hung in the air. He ran his hand across the new sign near the entrance. His name didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a memory, placed gently where it could do some good. And that was enough. A few weeks passed. The excitement settled. The photos stopped appearing in the local news. The hall no longer felt like a symbol. It felt like what it had always been, a place where people belonged. That's when the real legacy began to take shape. It started with small things. A young man started a weekly woodworking class inside the hall, said his grandfather had taught him and now it was his turn. A woman who once served in Iraq came forward and asked if she could start a letter-writing group for deployed soldiers. She said it helped her once, maybe it could help someone else. Then came the idea for an archive. Not a museum, an archive. Jonah pitched it. He said stories didn't belong behind glass, they belonged in reach. He wanted people to walk in and hold a letter, see a photo, read a journal entry written in pencil by a 19-year-old who once wore a uniform. He wanted history to breathe. Chuck watched it all unfold without stepping forward. He just stayed close, available, present. One evening, Jonah knocked on his door, said he had something to show him. Chuck followed him to the hall where a table had been set with a cloth and a single binder resting in the middle. The front cover read, Founders, Volume 1. Inside were letters from townspeople, some long, some just a line or two. Thank you for not letting us forget. You didn't need to lead, you just had to stay. This place is better because you can sit down in it. Chuck turned the pages slowly. He stopped at one near the back. It was typed, but the signature was written by hand. It was from a judge. The same judge who had once rejected a memorial project Chuck proposed for returning veterans back in the 90s. The letter said, I was wrong. I confused tradition with discomfort. You reminded us that silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means shame. Thank you for pulling us back to something honest. Chuck didn't say anything, just closed the binder and rested his hand on top of it. Then, about 2 months after the dedication, a letter came from Austin. It was from the Texas State Commission on Heritage and Civic Legacy. The letter invited Chuck to attend a ceremony at the Capitol. They were establishing a new program, local legacy sites, public spaces preserved not because of their architecture, but because of the people who fought to keep them alive. The Crossfield Veterans Hall would be the first. Chuck read the letter twice. He didn't answer right away. Linda asked if he planned to go. He said he wasn't sure. She smiled, said, I think it already matters, even if you stay home. In the end, he went. Not for himself, for Jonah, for the people who still didn't know their stories mattered, for the idea that standing still in one small town could send a signal farther than anyone expected. Chuck didn't speak at the ceremony. Jonah did. He told the room about a building that was almost sold off, and a man who said 5 sentences and made the whole town stand still. He said Chuck didn't demand anything, he just reminded people of what they already knew but had forgotten how to hold. He ended by saying, we didn't save a building, we remembered who we were because someone showed us how. The audience rose to their feet, not for Jonah, not even for Chuck, for the idea that truth doesn't fade, it waits, patient, quiet, ready. When Chuck returned to Crossfield, the town greeted him not with banners or parades, just open doors, warm nods, a fresh coat of paint on the old bench outside the hall, and a new brass plate screwed into the frame. It read, "Reserved for whoever shows up when no one else will." Chuck sat on it the next morning, coffee in one hand. The breeze was pulling gently at the collar of his coat. He looked at the flag waving above the door, at the windows glowing from inside. A child racing up the steps, too young to know the full story, but old enough to feel the weight of a place that had been fought for. Chuck closed his eyes for a moment, and in that stillness one truth settled in deeper than any plaque or speech ever could. Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we make room for while we're still here. It started with a sound. Not a speech, not a song, just the soft, clear picking of a guitar on a Thursday night in early fall. The kind of sound that fills a room without taking over it. The kind of sound that makes people pause without realizing why. The room was the same. The Crossfield Veterans Hall. Same chairs. Same wood floors. But something felt different. Like the walls had finally exhaled. Jonah sat near the front. His fingers moved slowly but surely across the strings. He wasn't playing a song anyone knew. He was playing something old. Something borrowed. Something from the place itself. Chuck was there too, quiet. Second row this time. Someone had insisted he take a softer chair. He didn't fight it. More people had shown up that night than expected, not because it was a special event, but because the word had gotten around. Jonah had written a short piece in the town paper, one column tucked inside the weekly section. It read, "Some rooms don't need microphones, they just need someone who remembers the tune." No one had known it would land the way it did, but it did. The old hall filled slowly. People brought thermoses, blankets, a sense that they were part of something they couldn't name but didn't want to miss. As Jonah played, no one whispered, no one checked their phones. Even the children stayed still, leaning gently against their parents' sides. When he finished, there was no applause. Just stillness. Then someone stood. An older woman in a wool shawl. She walked to the center of the room and told a story about her brother and how he used to sit in that hall and hum during meetings. Said she hadn't heard that sound since he passed. Then another person stood, a retired mail carrier. Said he once delivered a letter to Chuck's house during a storm. Didn't know who he was then, just knew he shook his hand like a man who carried the world gently. That night, no one kept track of time. People stayed long after the music stopped. They shared coffee and slices of pie brought from home. Someone started recording stories on an old cassette deck. Someone else passed around a scrapbook. No one labeled it a project, no one took credit. It just was. Over the next few weeks, Thursday nights became something more. The guitar came out each time. Sometimes it was Jonah, sometimes someone else. Songs that didn't need lyrics. Tunes that felt like memories. Chuck didn't always speak, but when he did, people leaned in, not because he spoke loudly. He spoke like someone who had already said everything he needed to, but stayed, in case you had something to say. Then one evening, he didn't come. There was no announcement, just an empty chair. People noticed, but no one panicked, because Chuck didn't need to be present for the room to remember. The stories still flowed, the music still played, but in between the notes there was a hush. The kind of hush you only get when something holy has passed through. That Saturday, Linda visited Chuck. He was home, sitting on the porch, blanket over his legs, book in his lap. She said nothing at first. Then she asked if he was okay. He smiled, said he was tired. Not of the people, just off the noise outside, the kind of silence he had worked so hard to protect. She said the hall was strong now because he reminded them what strength really was. Chuck nodded. said that's all he ever wanted, not to be remembered, just to make sure the right things were. The next week, something happened that no one expected. A bus arrived. From 3 towns over. Students, teachers, veterans, they had read Jonah's article. I watched clips someone posted online about the Thursday night gatherings. They didn't come for a tour. They came to listen. That night, every chair was filled. The floors had blankets, the back doors stayed open for fresh air and the sound of crickets. Chuck came early. He didn't sit in the second row this time. He stood in the back against the wall, arms folded, watching. The guitar was played. Voices rose. A 12-year-old stood and said her great-uncle served in a war she couldn't name but now wanted to learn about. A teenage boy read a poem about losing his grandfather during COVID and finding his photo on the wall of the hall. Chuck listened. Then something extraordinary happened. No one asked him to speak. No one needed to. The room rose. One by one. Not in applause, not in tribute. They stood the way people stand when someone walks into a church. Not because of who he was, but because of what he held. A mirror, a memory, a truth. That influence doesn't always wear a title. Sometimes it just wears boots and stands quietly until the world is finally quiet enough to hear itself again. At that moment, Chuck didn't need to say anything, because the room already knew what it meant to carry something sacred and to pass it on.